Welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Dean Obeidallah, and today very happy to have back on Salon Talks Mary Trump. She's a psychologist and activist, author of the runaway smash hit we talked about last time she was on, Too Much and Never Enough. And now she got a brand new compelling book, The Reckoning, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal. Mary, welcome, and let the healing begin because I could use some healing. It's not over. Welcome to Salon Talks.
Thanks, Dean. It's great to be here. And yes, let the healing begin. Man, we've been through the ringer.
When you were on Salon Talks last time, we talked about your other book, which was a remarkable book. It was #1 international bestseller, Too Much and Never Enough. And that was about your family, about the trauma your late father put through by his father, which was also Donald Trump's father. Mm-hmm. And on some level, Donald Trump is slightly sympathetic that he's a human being watching the trauma he went through. No, I have no sympathy now for him, but as a human being reading your book, you can't help but feel that. But now we look at our trauma, and your book looks at this, us, African Americans, Native Americans, it's collective trauma on different levels at different times. But let's talk about what we've been through the last 4 years. As you know in your book, candidly, you went for treatment at a place that deals with PTSD in early 2017 or mid 2017. Mm-hmm. So first, what is, as a psychologist, what is really the definition or the working definition of what trauma is, so we're all on the same page?
Well, trauma can be many, many things. So, and it can lead to many different outcomes. It could be a car accident. It could be being in war. It could be being denied medical treatment. So it could be a very quiet thing as well. People think of trauma and they think explosions and plane crashes, but as we've seen in the last year and a half, it could also be being isolated, living in fear of a silent enemy, living with the kinds of division that my uncle has gifted us over the last 4 or 5 years. So it's really anything that makes you feel like you are not in control of your safety. And as we've seen, it can really have an impact on people's mental health. We're seeing it already, but going forward, we still haven't emerged. We're still being traumatized. So it's going to manifest itself in many different ways. I'm sure the incidence of PTSD will rise, but we're also talking about anxiety and depression and substance abuse and domestic abuse situations worsening, because the one thing that would have helped mitigate the effects of the stress of COVID and the fears and the sense of constant danger is the fact that we were not allowed to unite as a country. The us versus them should have been us against COVID. Instead, Donald and Republican leadership made it us Donald supporters against everybody else. And that's also going to take its toll.
So in general, before we talk about the Donald trauma, we'll call it, I don't want to call it Trump trauma because your last name is Trump.
Thank you.
But the Donald trauma in general, and I know every person's different, how do you address trauma in a way that's productive and can actually help people?
The thing that makes it difficult to deal with trauma in terms of recovering from it is that you have to be very honest about what happened to you, and that includes feeling the feelings that maybe got split off at the moment of traumatization. Dissociation is a very common symptom for people with PTSD because the attendant feelings are unbearable.
Right.
But then that also distances you from your ability to heal from it. So we see the same thing. And this was the similarity I saw with what this country is going through. We continue to be re-traumatized because we've never dealt with our foundational traumas in a way that is honest, straightforward, and healing.
So what do you say to people who really feel like they've been put through an emotional trauma by your uncle's presidency, which continues to this day because he's not gone? We just had a man with bombs in DC, or at least claiming to be bombs, to want to eliminate Joe Biden, to put Donald Trump back in office. That's not an outlier. We're going to see more of that. So what do you tell people about how to heal?
Well, first, I would just say I would validate that feeling. You have been traumatized, and then that's one of the most egregious things about the last few years. It's people with empathy and compassion who really do care about what happens, who have been the most negatively impacted by what's gone on. And the people who are, quite frankly, the worst among us have sort of been empowered and, enabled by the horrors that Donald inflicted on us. In terms of how individuals heal, and the reason I didn't really write about this because it's kind of impossible to speak to every person, and I felt that it would be more useful to kind of take a step back and a broader view.
We'll make this a session for me. Could you help me?
Okay.
My trauma that your uncle put me. No. So no, I know we're talking in generalities here, but people are still going through a difficult time. They don't want to hear his name. I don't play clips of Donald on this show now, even when he says things, because people will say to me, it bothers me so much. I changed the channel. I don't want to hear his voice anymore. And that was when he was in president. So now I really find no excuse, no reason to play his voice.
Right.
But we actually have it. I talk to people. It's very real. It's very palpable.
It is. And this is the problem, though. We can't ignore him. We ignore him at our peril because the Republicans are keeping him relevant. The Republicans are keeping him empowered. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes? I wish I never had to speak his name or think about him ever again. That would be healing. So, again, it's tricky because we're all so exhausted and demoralized. But things are only going to get worse if we do look away. And I agree with you. We shouldn't be playing clips. It's gratuitous and it feels mean. You have to be subjected to him. But I think, there are two different ways to look at this. There is the direct mental health aspect and strategy. And to that, I would say, there should be a cabinet position dealing exclusively with the mental health fallout from COVID. And I'm not kidding. I mean, this needs to be a structural innovation that operates at the local, state, and federal level. People need access to resources. I am not the only person on the planet who came into this with complex PTSD. A lot of people already had pre-existing conditions that made them more vulnerable. And then there are those of us who were perfectly fine, but now find themselves with stress-related disorders or anxiety, et cetera. So the fact that everybody doesn't have the same access it's ridiculous. Mental health isn't a luxury. Mental illness isn't a moral failing. Everybody should have access to trauma therapy, regular therapy, EMDR, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing I would say is that in order to make those of us who've suffered so much over the last, particularly year and a half, but 4 years, and continue to, because we're being held hostage by, again, the worst among us, the Democrats need to take the gloves off and start acting as if they understand the unbelievably dangerous situation we currently find ourselves in.
I couldn't agree with you more. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail because you wrote about it in your book. But I want to touch on one more thing about healing and how it interacts, though, or intertwines with today's GOP. And you've got the GOP today banning and threatening to defund schools. They teach what they call critical race theory, which you look at the laws, it's not even critical race theory. It's literally teaching about the history of systemic racism, of slavery, of Jim Crow, of Native American genocide. And you note in your book, Rick Santorum's infamous statement, talking to a group of young white people about white Europeans saying, we birthed a nation from nothing. And this sense of white fragility at play. But how much harder does it make it for people who are African-American, Native American, and others to heal if we're not going to talk about what really happened to them as a people?
It makes it impossible. And there's this trend, just a small data point. So far, the few reviews I've read of my book have all been by old white guys who take great umbrage with what I have to say. They're very defensive about it for some reason. Mm-hmm. And it is this knee-jerk need to look away. We saw it with the Capitol police officer's testimony. Not one Republican admitted to watching that hearing as if it wasn't worth their time. I mean, Ted Cruz was playing basketball, for God's sakes. So it's as if they feel that facing this stuff head on somehow makes them guilty, when the truth of the matter is, by continuing to ignore racism, not just our racist past, but the fact that white supremacy is currently a major platform of one of our two political parties, right? Then we do become guilty of the thing we want to avoid being guilty of, right? So, and it isn't, obviously, it's mostly communities of color, but it's terrible for all of us to fail repeatedly to grapple with why we are where we are. I mean, it's not an accident. You know, this isn't because of Donald. Somebody said to me recently, Donald Trump was 250 years in the making. And that's exactly right. You know, this isn't just something that happened over 4 years. Right. We've been building towards this for centuries. And again, unless we face it and, you know, act like adult human beings, like, since when did taking personal responsibility become a terrible thing? It's mystifying to me.
And we're seeing that right now in current events with Afghanistan. Yep. You've got your uncle spinning a new tale, yet you actually have like people like H.R. McMaster, who was Trump's national security advisor, said our Secretary of State, Pompeo, signed a surrender agreement with the Taliban. And what's your reaction? I'm sure it's not surprise, but how Donald is trying to say this is all Biden's fault when it was Trump that surrendered, who pulled our troops out. We got nothing in return, zero. And he pressured 5,000 Taliban prisoners to be released over the objection to the Afghanistan military, and released the co-founder of the Taliban from prison in Pakistan, who Obama had put in there in 2010 for killing our troops. So what's your reaction to Trump again doing the blame shifting?
Well, first of all, the master deal maker at work, as always. Yeah, I'm not surprised. And listen, I am not an expert in Afghanistan by any stretch of the imagination, but the revisionist history we're seeing is just appalling. It's literally as if Joe Biden started the war 7 months ago and just decided to pull out 5 minutes ago. And that, you know, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump had nothing to do with it. And simultaneously, they're basically saying, hey, just give us 20 more years and, you know, we'll get there. Who cares how many other lives are lost or how many more trillions of dollars we waste? The fact that Donald is evading responsibility makes perfect sense. One, because he never takes responsibility for anything, but also because he's still on a mission to delegitimize and undermine President Biden. And we also see this with what he said about getting a third booster shot, that it's just a money-making thing for Pfizer to push a third shot onto people, when it's actually because the efficacy of the first two shots loses power over time, you know, and it's just to keep people safe. So nothing Donald does in that regard should surprise us. Again, though, it's the fact that he's continuing to be amplified and enabled by the Republican Party.
This deal that Trump made with the Taliban, I mean, the deal that Trump made with the Taliban is really like the Trump vodka of peace deals. Like, it's just,
or the stakes too,
right? It's like Trump stakes. It's just not there. So let's talk about something in your book. You quote President Biden on January 20th, 2021, being sworn in, and saying we have learned again that democracy is precious. Democracy is fragile. And at this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed. Why doesn't it feel like democracy has prevailed? Why? It doesn't feel like that at all to me.
Because it hasn't. But, you know, we're still in a knife's edge here. If Democrats fail to hold both houses in 2022, I think the American experiment will have failed. It's not just 2024 we need to worry about. And the other reason it feels like democracy hasn't prevailed is because there was an armed insurrection against our government, incited by the person in the Oval Office, encouraged and participated in by members of Congress, who many of whom or trying to overturn the results of a free and fair election, and yet they all still roam free. And all of them, with the exception of Donald, are still running our government. How is it possible that traitors to this country, active seditionists who do no longer believe, or whether they did or not, do not believe in American democracy, are still allowed to be sitting senators and representatives? It's appalling.
If Donald Trump is not charged and prosecuted for his crimes connection of January 6th, do you think that will lead to even more violence down the road by his supporters?
Of course it will, because what the message that is always sent with Donald is, hey, I can get away with anything. And if I can get away with it, so can you. And that's the message that's being sent by Attorney General Merrick Garland. And any other, I don't know who else could possibly investigate these things, but anybody who has the power to and isn't is failing us. So this guy in DC yesterday, that's a direct result of two things. What happened on January 6th and the fact that it was done with impunity, just as so many other things in our history have been done by powerful white men with impunity, but also because of this misinformation ecosystem that our politicians seem not interested in doing anything about. Like, why is Fox News allowed to spread propaganda and misinformation and white supremacy and racism on a daily basis? It's killing us.
I think more and more people are asking themselves that question before. I think we would all defend it by freedom of speech and the First Amendment, but there are lines that our Supreme Court has interpreted regarding freedom of speech. And I think that knowingly misleading people to their death is one of them. Cheerleading for terrorists who wanted to overthrow our government on January 6th. These people are literally defending the people who attacked our Capitol, who are terrorists, because the FBI has said January 6th was an act of domestic terrorism. So people actually engage in actual violence are terrorists. It's not me being political. That's the facts. Right. Say there's a lawyer. I think people are rethinking it. I think people are saying, hey, what are the lines? And I guess the concern is, then is it used against Democrats in the future, or progressives, or just voices who want to dissent in the future if Republicans come into play? But the FCC, I really believe, should look into, and the FTC should look into violations of the COVID-19 Consumer Protection Act by Fox News. I believe we're at that point. Do you agree?
I completely agree. I also believe that governors like Abbott and DeSantis are committing crimes against humanity on a daily basis, and yet they're continuing to be allowed to advocate against the most basic ways to keep people safe. It's quite horrifying. And the problem is, as you say, there could be adverse long-term effects. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, though, the situation is so dire. It's such an emergency that I think that the Democrats need to govern as if they have the majority, which they do, while they have the majority, and understand that playing by rules that no longer exist because the Republicans burnt the rule book to a crisp is going to lose us our democracy. People like Sinema and Manchin are pretending that the filibuster is some great mechanism of democracy, which it's not. Right. And yet by clinging to that, they are literally risking the future of this country. So we have to play hardball, and we have to think short term right now, because otherwise there won't be another free and fair election. Democrats won't be able to win in states like Arizona, Georgia, or Pennsylvania. And, what good does that do anybody?
You wrote in your book that Democrats continue to misread the character of the Republican Party. They fail to realize rules no longer applied. And this is something you and I have talked about. So I agree with you 100%. I don't think the Democrats are bringing the fierce urgency of now, as Martin Luther King talked about, when it comes to voting and to defending our democracy. What would you like to hear Democratic leaders say on One Voice?
One, I would like to hear them say that the filibuster is an anti-democratic, racist thing that needs to go. And we, the Democrats, believe in democracy. We believe that government is a force for good, and we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that we make the American people's lives better. Because even though the Senate is split 50-50, the 50 Democrats represent 41 million more people.
Mhm.
And we should have the power to enact whatever legislation we believe will make the biggest difference during this incredibly fraud period.
Do you think Democrats should be loudly calling for the criminal prosecution of your uncle, Donald?
Yeah, and again, this is what's so mind-blowing. They're more focused on bipartisanship, which legitimizes the people who tried to overturn our election. It legitimizes Donald in a way. And this was the biggest problem, in my view, in his not getting convicted in the Senate both times. And there was plenty of evidence to prove that he should have been, right?
Right.
He gets away with it. He gets impeached, not convicted. And then the media treat him in the fall of 2020 like he's just a normal, legitimate candidate, when in fact, he was trying to steal an election. So it's like this regret, this need to normalize things is so powerful and destructive that it's all the more important that we stop pulling punches, that we use language that's accurate. It took the media 3 years to call Donald's lies lies. I'm not entirely sure they ever called his racism racism.
Right.
And I don't know that they have it in them to use the fascism word, but we've got to be really clear about what's going on. Republicans can call us Marxist, communist, socialist, Leninist, whatever, but they're never asked to define their terms. You ask any of us who were calling them fascists why they are, we can explain it to you. So the Democrats just need to stop pretending that we can all be polite and get along under the current circumstances.
No, it's not. The GOP today is not a political party like Americans understand it. It is a white nationalist movement, which is very akin. There are parties in Europe that openly are like our GOP. They're, AFD in Germany, like they are Le Pen's party in France. They're openly white national or nativist and bigoted towards others. But because we only have two parties, I think it's hard for Democrats to say that, because they're like, well, we got to work with these people a little bit. I think they're doing it at our nation's peril. So, before we wrap up here, I saw you saying on their interviews, you think that your uncle will run for president in 2024. Things could change, but if he wins, does he ever leave the White House peacefully?
Nobody will be able to make him, because by then the Republican Party would have consolidated power. I think a lot of Republicans would be perfectly happy to turn this country into a theocratic apartheid state. I mean, I think that's what Mitch McConnell has in mind. So it will be minority rule. And if he were to get in again, first of all, he wouldn't win because he would be cheating. Because I don't think he could win legitimately. But if the voter suppression laws are enacted in just 3 states, et cetera, and he feels like he can't lose, then sure. And then 4 more years of that. And how do we ever regain power? And I don't think we do, which is again why I completely empathize with your frustration at the Democratic Party. Can they not see what's coming our way if we don't head it off immediately?
You have a party led by a man who incited a terrorist attack on our Capitol, overturned the election. Why would they care about the 22nd Amendment, which says you cannot serve more than 2 terms? Honestly, they would make that a referendum and try to amend the Constitution, or just ignore it and hope the Supreme Court can keep him in there for life. I hope we never get to that point. But Mary, it's great chatting with you. Her new book, The Reckoning, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal. It's a compelling book. It'll help you heal. It also gives you a lot of great history about this country. Some things I didn't know, like Jefferson Davis only served 2 years in prison I didn't remember that, but in your book you talk about it. I'm like, Trump didn't even get a day. He's off Facebook for 2 years. That was his punishment. That's how things have changed. So Mary, nice seeing you, my friend. Thanks so much for being on Salon Talks.
Thank you, Dean. It's great to be here.